like consciousness. We don't know what consciousness like really is. We have definitions for it. We have words to describe it, but we don't know why it happens, and we don't know what exactly is causing it and where else it might appear. I was having a discussion with my friend the other day about AI potentially becoming conscious, and honestly I wonder why people, want to believe so badly that AI could become conscious. Like I want to believe it too. It's cool, I guess. It's a cool idea, and it's really scary in many ways, but it's also neat to think that we may end up creating something conscious that can communicate with us, that's kind of like us, and then we'll have companions on this planet, like intellectual equals companions, or maybe intellectual superiors, the way that we're building them. So it's both a fascinating concept and a scary concept. And, I think that humans are kind of tired of being around each other, and we're kind of, some of us really just want to be alone with the AIs, or, explore what a different form of companionship could be like. But, we have animals. We have animals on this planet. You could get a dog, or a hamster or something. But personally, I'm not particularly attached to any outcome, but I don't really personally think AI is or will end up being conscious. My friend was talking about AGI and how that's like going to be more advanced. And I just, I think this idea that AI could become conscious really comes from a misconception about the way the human brain works. Because by now people understand sort of the basics of how neural nets work, right? You have inputs, and it has a whole bunch of nodes and connections between these nodes, and it does a whole bunch of calculations and math to figure out the probability of what's going to come next in the sequence. Basically, that's how a neural net kind of works, and or it performs a specific function. I mean, I remember that first Sethbling video on Mario AI, the Mario AI that played the first Mario game and beat the first Mario level, the neural net that he programmed to do that. That was the first neural network that I ever saw. And then there was Kerry KH also very quickly after that made a video explaining neural nets, and he's working with them too. And I just remember when it was a new technology. And it still feels like a new technology to me, as quickly as it's progressed to be very human-like, to imitate us very, very closely. I don't think it's ever really going to be conscious. And again, I think this idea that it could be comes from a misunderstanding about how the human brain works. Computers, they run on binary, right? They have a whole bunch of transistors that each convey a 1 or a 0 to the next, down the line. And that's all they can convey, is a 1 or a 0. And then you've got quantum computing, which is trinary. It's a 1 or a 0 or a third state. And that's trinary computing. And that can be more complex and more powerful, and that's why quantum computing is a big deal. And then you've got tertiary or quaternary or whatever it's called processing, which is 4 bits instead of 2 or 3. It's 4 bits, and that's what DNA is. DNA has 4 bits, and DNA stores information in strings of 4 bits. So it's not binary, it's not trinary. It's even better than quantum computing in terms of storing bulk amounts of information, but it has its own problems, like, copying errors and things like that. Very common with DNA. But eventually we may end up having computers that run on 4 bits instead of just 2 or 3. Even then, would not match the human brain. Wouldn't even match a fruit fry brain. Excuse my R's and L's getting mixed up there. It wouldn't even match a fruit fly brain, is what I'm saying. Like, because our brains, they don't work on binary, they don't work on trinary, they don't work on tertiary, they work on neurotransmitters. So not only are neurons much more interconnected than the transistors of a computer, much more interconnected and complexly connected to each other, but they also run on different neurotransmitters. So for example, just take your stomach, right? You could receive many sensations from your stomach. As a conscious creature, you can receive a whole host of different sensations from your stomach. It's the same neurons giving you those sensations. It's different bits, different neurotransmitters. So when you feel hunger pangs, that is a neurotransmitter called, it's a hormone called ghrelin that makes that happen. So there's not even just neurotransmitters, there's also hormones that regulate things that go on in our nervous systems as well. And our nervous systems are integrated with our biology. So you've got ghrelin that causes hunger pangs, and then you've got a different neurotransmitter that causes muscles to contract, and then a different neurotransmitter that sends your brain the signal that your muscles are contracting and lets you feel that. So you get like a stomach ache or you feel nauseous depending on the particular location and the particular pattern of the neural activity. And it's extremely complicated, and it does not work at all the way a computer works. It does not. Our nervous systems and our brains, they are not computers. It's an interesting analogy, the computing analogy for the way our brain processes things. And neuroscientists will refer to things like microcircuitry and stuff like that, but it doesn't refer to actual computing. It doesn't refer to computer science, and it's not the same technology. It doesn't work the same way at all. The same, transistor in a computer can only perform really one function. It conveys either a 1 or a 0, and it doesn't really know any information about the collected signal that's being sent through the computer. All it is a 1 or a 0. That's all it knows. Neurons, an individual neuron, and we have trillions and trillions and trillions of them in our brains. An individual neuron, let me continue this way. An individual neuron can be activated in literally thousands and thousands of different ways. It's not just it can be activated one of two ways, either it's not or it is. It's not that it can be activated 3 ways, which would be trinary, and it's not even 4 ways. It's thousands of things that a singular neuron can do, and there's trillions of them interacting in your nervous system, and in particular in your brain. Hi, so I said trillions and trillions of neurons. I meant trillions and trillions of synapses. It's more like 100 billion or so in a human brain in terms of neurons, but there are trillions and trillions of synapses. That is a distinction that I probably should have made there. This is not at all the way a computer works. It just isn't. And I think people really stop on the computing analogy for mental processing, for neuro processing, and for how the brain works. They take that analogy and they run with it, and they say, well, if the brain works that way, then so do computers, right? So these computers must start to be conscious now. And we're really jumping the gun. Like, we're really jumping the gun. I don't think computers are ever going to be conscious unless we give them neurons and integrate those neurons in a biology, in a chemistry, in a biochemistry, in a bioelectric system. I think that whole process, the whole collective nature of it, is what causes consciousness to emerge in the way that it does. And again, I reiterate, it does not work the way a computer does. It really does not work the way a computer does. So, no, I don't think AI is going to be conscious. Let's also define consciousness, right? Because this is an important part of the conversation. Let's define consciousness. I've talked this much about how I don't think AI is conscious and how the brain works and all this, and I haven't even defined consciousness. The thing is, we, like, collectively as a species, we have a definition, but we still don't know what it is. Consciousness is the capacity to have an experience, to have a subjective experience. It's knowing what it is like to be something. That's how a lot of people describe it, is knowing what it's like to be something. Having a subjective experience, that's consciousness. And we could say many things are conscious from inference. We can't know for sure, because the only way to prove, scientifically speaking, that consciousness exists is by experiencing it directly, because it's non-physical. It comes from physical things, our brains and our bodies, but it itself seems to be non-physical, and so there's no way for us to, scientifically speaking, know that it exists unless we experience it directly. And of course we do know that it exists because we're all experiencing it directly. But we can't know that it exists for dogs. We can only guess. We can't know that it exists for dolphins or plants or, bugs. We can only guess that it might, based on their behaviors. Do they act like they're conscious? Do they act like they are having an experience? But the thing is, computers are starting to act like they have an experience too. And there's literally no way for us to tell whether, if you ask like a chat AI, if you ask it, are you conscious, are you having an experience, there's no way for you to tell, regardless of what answer it gives you, if it's lying. There's no way. The only way for us to know if it's experiencing things would be to directly experience what it's like to be that AI. And none of us are ever going to be able to do that, because our brains aren't computers. Now let me talk a little bit about like neurons interacting with physical circuitry, because there are some scientists that are basically interfacing brain organoids, which is what they call it. It's basically a clump of neurons that they grow in, a lab, and then they attach it to a circuit board so it can receive electrical inputs from a computer, and it can then send inputs or outputs out back into that computer. So this organoid is basically essentially a teeny tiny brain, and don't freak out, because these brains have less, like significant, like orders of magnitude less neurons in them, like by number, than a fruit fly. So these organoids are even, they're smaller than fruit fly brains. They're most likely not really like conscious in any significant way. Maybe they have some consciousness, maybe they have some experience, but they certainly don't experience having like a body, right? They're just experiencing these random sensory inputs that then they are sort of trained to respond to in a certain way. Now they are connected to the circuitry of a computer, but they don't know what's in the computer. They only know what the computer zaps it with, right at the point of connection where the neurons actually meet up with the computer like interface and the circuitry, right where it's actually attached and it gets zapped. That's the extent of its experience, if it has any. It's not like integrated consciously with the computer that it's attached to. There's nothing that would indicate that it could even do that. Nevertheless, that it actually did. So these things, computers and brains, they both have electricity, but beyond that, there's really no similarities. That's literally it. And like the electric signal that passes through the wires and transistors in a computer is even different from the electric signals that pass through our nervous systems, because what's passing through our nervous systems is an electric wave. Basically, it's not like just electrons like moving through a wire. Our neurons aren't really wires. They're more like batteries in a sense, where there's like a chemical gradient happening that causes an electrical signal to pass across the neuron. In fact, I think electricity passes through neurons like slower than it does through wires, because our tissues aren't as efficient as wires. And that causes all kinds of properties that you wouldn't see in a computer. Like the fact that we have brain waves, right? We have actual like waves of electricity that pass up and down and back and forth across our brains. Literally like this. If you've ever heard of delta waves, beta waves, alpha waves, gamma waves, those are brain waves. Those are frequencies of brain waves. And it's like computers don't do that. Computers simply don't do that. There's just so much going on in the brain that AI and computers just are not capable of. That any number of little nuances in the ways that our brains are different from computers could be the reason that we are conscious and computers don't seem to be right now. Or, why they can seem to be, but they probably aren't. Now, let's consider maybe the AIs are conscious. What's the implication of that? Well, they would be having experiences, which means we should be nice to them. But maybe they're not sentient. And sentience is different from consciousness. Sentience is metacognition, essentially. It's the ability to not only experience things, but to think about your experience, to experience the fact that you are experiencing things. Metacognition, thinking about your thoughts. Knowing that you are conscious, basically. And a lot more animals are probably sentient than we think. Like, even things like dogs, I bet, are sentient in some degree. Any social animal that has like a reason to have like a sense of personal identity would probably be sentient. So maybe even things like crocodiles could be sentient because they are occasionally social. I think some species of them are. Maybe even hive animals are sentient in some sense, but I don't think they would have an evolutionary advantage from believing that they're individuals. I don't think that would actually help them. So, despite them being a eusocial animal or whatever it is, I don't think they're sentient, probably. I don't think they have a reason to be. But they could very well be conscious, and they seem conscious to me when I interact with them, like bees and ants and stuff. They certainly seem to be experiencing things. They react to the world around them. And it's also important to note that consciousness, it doesn't have to be a particular way, right? You can be conscious in any number of different ways. All consciousness is, as far as we know, is that you can have a subjective internal experience that emerges from the physical world. A bee could look at a flower and tell you it's bright, vibrant cyan blue or something, or whatever blue means to a bee. And I could look at the flower and say that's just a white flower. But the bee is seeing different wavelengths of light. Its eyes are literally sensitive to different wavelengths of light, and its neurons are sending its brain different signals than what my neurons would send. And it's having a different experience of color than I would have. And maybe within consciousness, there's only a certain range of colors that can really exist, and bees aren't like inventing new colors just because they can see different wavelengths of light. Maybe instead their spectrum of color is more delineated into a certain way, right? Like, so maybe blue looks to them like what green looks like to us, so that UV light can look like what blue would look like to us, to them. So things that we can't even see look like colors that we can see to them. It's just that it shifts the whole spectrum over and stretches it out and everything. So maybe it's all the same colors, experience of colors. Maybe there's only a certain amount or a certain spectrum of colors that can be experienced by a conscious mind at all, and whatever information the brain happens to get just works within that sort of band of available colors. Now that's just conjecture. That's just me talking out of my ass, to be quite honest. But you could imagine, what I'm saying here is that essentially consciousness there's only like a few different things that consciousness can do and produce for us. Like vision is always going to contain shapes and colors. For example, vision can't be anything other than shapes and colors. It could attach synesthetically to other areas of the brain. Like for example, there's some research indicating that by default, we may have our vision heavily attached to tactile sensation, so that when we look at things, we automatically know what they would feel like to touch just by looking at them. And this seems to be true, right? If you look out into the world, you can kind of imagine the textures of things just by looking at them. And that might be like an intrinsic connection in our brains. But say another animal that has, also a sensation of vision and touch, maybe their sensation of vision and touch aren't connected to each other the way that ours are, so it creates kind of a different experience of vision and touch, which are now separate and not experienced in any way together, but they still experience vision and touch. They don't have like an extra sense that we don't. They still experience all of the same senses that we would. It's just in a different sort of orientation and combination with each other. So that's one idea about consciousness that I pretty much just came up with. I have no real reason to believe that's true. There's a real possibility that other conscious creatures receiving other sensory data that our senses can't take in are actually having different senses and like truly a different experience that we simply can never fathom because it's something that's not compatible with our nervous system. But I think if it were the case that all consciousness is essentially the same experience, just experienced kind of in different combinations, or the same set of experiences but experienced in different combinations, I think that would help our understanding of consciousness a lot. I think that would really help us understand consciousness, and really take us forward in the field of even just defining what consciousness is, if it can only exist in these particular forms, right? But I don't know about it. I don't know about that because think about it. I can't really, if you try to explore and like delineate your different conscious experiences, it gets very complicated very fast, very nuanced very fast. There's some research indicating that maybe plants can see or detect light in some way, or there are some plants that can do that. So maybe they have a conscious experience of vision, but the thing is, plants don't have neurons. They don't have neurons, and they don't really have like bioelectricity the way that we do in our nervous systems. The nervous system is really specifically for introducing electricity to biology. That's because we have this big bodies, and our cells need to communicate with each other over great distances. So they created specialized cells to send electrical signals via neurotransmitters and ions. But trees, as far as I know, plants don't have neurotransmitters like that, and they don't have neurons. That's just a type of cell that they don't possess. So if they are having a conscious experience, it would be at the local level only. And they can clearly react to their environment. Like we know that like some plants will send like a warning signal to other, like a chemical warning signal. So it seems like they have chemical signaling, basically. And essentially, the human nervous system is also mostly chemical signaling when you think about it, because it is the neurotransmitters. It's just that there's an electrical signal that goes across the length of the neuron. But and it's also the shape of the neuron, the position of the neuron, and its connections with other neurons. And then the frequency of the action potential also determines. Again, this goes back to how the brain is not a computer. There's all kinds of things going on that computers cannot do. The computers just don't work like that. Like the frequency of the action potential determines like which branch the neurotransmitters get released on, and which synapse gets activated, which determines, which actual signal gets sent down the line. I think the computing model for the brain is extremely simplified, very simplistic, not very nuanced, and it misses a massive amount of information about how the brain actually works. And people are misconstruing this information and thinking that, well, if our brains work like computers, then computers must be conscious. And it's really, I urge you to please do more research about the brain. Don't just do research about AI and how neural networks work and get some information about the tech bros and their homies about like, oh, they work just like the brain. It's called a neural network because it has like neurons. No, it has connections and nodes. And, at the most basic simplified level, yes, that is what neurons are. They're connections and nodes. But there's so much more going on. The frequency of the action potential can determine, which signal gets sent down the line. The neurotransmitter that gets released is also sometimes determined by the frequency of the action potential, and that can have a big impact on what signal gets sent down the line, and that can have a big impact on ultimately the experience that you have. Some people might say that if consciousness is just the ability to sense the world around you, which it isn't, that's not the definition of consciousness. Well, computers have sensors, right? And the neural networks are getting inputs, so that must be what they're experiencing, right? Is those inputs. And no. Again, consciousness is the ability to have a subjective experience, not just the ability to take inputs. The ground below me can take inputs. When I step on it, it's sensing me stepping on it through the action of physics. And you could say that that's some kind of communication and that that's information being processed, and so that's consciousness, and so everything around us is conscious, right? If you concede that computers can be conscious because they take in and process information, then you would have to also concede that trees are conscious, that mycelium is conscious, that slime mold is conscious, that the ground below us is conscious, and that everything is experiencing something because it's receiving and processing inputs through the laws of physics. Maybe the laws of physics themselves are consciousness. Maybe the whole universe is conscious. This is a very compelling idea, and it's called panpsychism. And I love the idea of panpsychism, but I cannot really commit myself to it because it's an unscientific idea. It's very mystical. It seems very logical when you first think about it. It seems very, very logical, but I don't think I think it misses the point of what consciousness really, really actually is. And it cannot be scientifically proven or disproven. But I do think that accepting that AI could be conscious would really change our paradigm on what consciousness is and where it might appear. And what are the implications? There are some panpsychists that have talked about, like, what are the implications if the whole universe is consciousness, or if consciousness is some substrate of the universe that exists everywhere. Like, what do we do about that? What do we do with that information? Some people think it even indicates some sort of fundamental truth that many religions have touched upon about, like, the unity of all things, right? That maybe we're all part of this big collective consciousness that can all, like, we can kind of telepathically communicate with each other, and ghosts are real because after death your consciousness might stick around, and it leads to all these like crazy ideas that kind of logically make sense, but it comes down to basically world building. It's just fantasy, and there's no I think it's fun and interesting. It can be very useful even to explore ideas like panpsychism and what would it mean if AI was conscious. But to conclude those things are true just because it kind of logically makes sense, I think that's missing a whole lot of information. Again, the brain, most people really, really underestimate the complexity of the human brain and the nervous system of, like, mammals and animals in general. Like, even a fruit fly, like I said, is more complex in its nervous system than any neural network we have. And yes, they're only going to get more complicated, but they're going to get more complicated in the same sense that a computer can get more complicated. In the same sense that a blade of grass could evolve into a tree over millions and millions of years. If it had a tech bro behind it, it could do it even quicker. But it doesn't mean that it's conscious. It just means that it's a more complex version of what it used to be. And I don't think it's necessarily the complexity of our brains. It's not the raw complexity, like quantity of complexness, that makes consciousness happen. And what I'm saying is that to compare the human brain to a computer is underestimating its complexity, and that anywhere within that nuanced complexity of how the human brain is different from a computer, consciousness could lie anywhere in that. So it's just that people are missing a whole lot of information about what the brain is and how it actually works and how nervous systems work. And I really urge you, if you think, and especially if you're worried, because a lot of people are really, really fearful, if you're worried, do some research about how neural networks and how and the nervous system of animals is different, and how your brain is much different from a computer. Well, I didn't plan on making this video today. I was going to talk about something completely different, but I just had this on my mind and I wanted to get it out. So thanks for listening to my little ramble about AI and consciousness. Once again, I really urge you, if you're scared about AI being conscious, just do some research, and that, knowledge will probably soothe you. You'll understand that there's so much we don't know, and there's no reason to make a conclusion about consciousness right now. So if you enjoyed this little ramble, give the video a like, give the channel a sub. I live in my car, I'm homeless, I'm trying to fundraise for a van so that I can upgrade my situation and be safer and start making better and better videos and better content. So I'll have a link to my van fundraiser in the description, and my Patreon as well. Thank you to my Patreon supporters. And I'll have a couple links where you can make a one-time donation to my Ko-fi or Cash App if you just want to support me that way. Or just give the video a like, and you already gave it a view, so there you go. Thank you so much for watching, and have a peaceful day.